So non-Western Asian cultures tend to be more interdependent. So like we said, there's more of a focus on prosperity for the group or for the family. And so this is also referred to as a collectivist perspective. Whereas Western cultures, like our own, tend to have more independence. So there's more of that emphasis on the self and what your personal goals are. And so a lot of this has been found using a pretty interesting research technique called the 20 statements test. So what the researchers will do is they will get a group of people and ask each individual to answer or to produce 20 statements about themselves, 20 statements that describe you. Right? So essentially these would all take the form of I am and then some descriptor. Right? And so what they find in accordance with this distinction is that people from these cultures tend to describe, people from the non-Western Asian cultures tend to describe themselves more in terms of the group that they are a member of or the family that they're a part of, whereas people like us in Western cultures are a little bit more likely to describe what makes them different from everyone else, what makes you unique. All right. So there are some criticisms of this whole collectivist versus individualism distinction. So meta-analyses of these studies reveal that the effect size of these differences is relatively small. So going back to what we talked about in the sex differences chapter and talking about the size of that D statistic, what would be considered a small difference with this meta-analysis? Anybody remember the ballpark number?
0.2.
Yeah, so a D score of about 0.2 or around that is considered to be small. Right? And just like we saw with the sex differences, there are minimalists and maximalists. So minimalists say, well, if it's small, it's not that important. Maximalists say that even minute differences could still have some important ramifications. And so there is a lot of overlap across cultures in people's perspectives. So I know this might be hard to see here, but this scale along the bottom here, the horizontal axis, has individualism on this end, or an individualistic perspective. This is a collectivistic perspective, and then you have people who are in between. And most people are somewhere in between. Now there's quite a bit of overlap, as you can see. This is the average for American participants. This is the average for Asian participants. And so, I mean, there's a lot of shared variance here where Asian participants and American participants have a similar type of intermediate perspective. It's just that on average, people tend to be very different. Okay. Another criticism of these findings of cultural differences in self-concept suggests that the research that has produced these differences is a bit too general, and that you really need to look at the situation that someone is in if you want to understand the perspective that they take. So if you look at Americans, they might be more collectivist at home when they're interacting with their family, but more individualistic at work. And like I said, most of the research hasn't gone into that much depth in looking at when people report more of an individualistic or collectivistic perspective. So these cultural differences in self-concept have also revealed some differences in self-enhancement. So self-enhancement is just the tendency to describe yourself positively to others.
is still a criticism.
No, this isn't so much a criticism. This is a separate type of finding. Yeah, good question. So what they find is that American participants, when they complete something like that, the 20 statements test that I was just talking about, they make a lot more positive statements about themselves than participants from Asian cultures like Japan or Korea. American participants are also much more likely to endorse statements like, I am a hard worker, I am responsible, whereas the Asian participants were a little bit more likely to actually endorse negative statements about themselves. So there are two possible explanations that have been put forth for this basic difference. It is an interesting pattern. I see a few people still writing. Okay. So let's talk about the explanations of this effect. Now, it could be that this is a real difference. In other words, it does actually reflect self-concept, and Americans just think more highly of themselves. Or it could have something to do with the measurement technique that was used. So it could be that participants in these different cultures use different impression management strategies. And that there aren't really big differences between how American participants and Japanese participants think of themselves or see themselves, but American participants just present themselves as being really exceptional, whereas Japanese participants present themselves in a more humble manner. So the private self-concept, what you think of yourself, wouldn't be that different if this were the case. It's just the public self-concept, how you present yourself to others. So which one of the problems with self-report measures that we talked about way back when would this reflect?
Sometimes people's ideas of themselves are skewed or biased.
Okay, yeah. So that's one aspect that could be important. So that would be the case if this were true, this first explanation. So some people Americans might just be more biased in favor of themselves. Any other ideas about how this could relate to some of those problems with self-report measures?
They want themselves to appear like good or great or whatever.
Yeah. Remember the social desirability bias? So there could be just a different bias for Asian cultures, whereas instead of wanting to appear really awesome and wonderful, there could be a different norm over there that suggests that you shouldn't present yourself as being the best person ever. You should present yourself as a humble and modest individual, and that's what's desirable over there, and that there are just different norms between the different cultures. Yeah, so that's another explanation there. Yeah. So there's also some variation in personality within cultures. So there's some really interesting research suggesting that someone's social class, which is kind of related to their socioeconomic status, whether they're rich or poor, that this could have an effect on their personality. So most of the research on this topic has been done by a person by the name of Melvin Kahn. So little Melvin and his colleagues. It's not often that you hear about a researcher named Melvin. I love that. So anyway, they suggest that lower class parents tend to be more likely to emphasize obedience to authority to their children. So in other words, children from poorer, lower class families are taught that you better obey the rules and stay within the lines, keep out of trouble. And that's what's most important. Whereas children from high class, more wealthy families tend to have their parents emphasize different things to them. So their parents might emphasize that they should be unique individuals and work on their decision-making skills and decide what they want to do with their lives. And so Kahn and colleagues suggested that this might stem from the different types of jobs that they expect for their children. So if you expect your children to have a really low-level entry job, then in most of those positions, the most important thing to do, if you want to do well, is just kind of follow instructions and stay out of trouble. Do what your boss tells you. Whereas if you were in a leadership position, well, then having things like self-direction and coming up with creative solutions to problems and things like that can be really advantageous. So that's the basic idea behind Kahn's research for how some of these differences might emerge within a certain culture. So, any questions about that? It's kind of an interesting idea. All right. So now let's go ahead and talk about some cultural universals. So we touched on this briefly earlier when we talked about moral universals. But these will be features of personality that seem to be present in just about all cultures across the world. And there's been some interesting research done on this. So there's an anthropologist by the name of Donald Brown, and I brought his book and spilled water all over it. He wrote this book called Human Universals, in which he surveys a lot of research and looks at the things that are commonly found across all human cultures. And your textbook summarizes some of these. So there tends to be things like preferential treatment given to family members over non-family members. Like I said, you can read more about those in your textbook. One of my favorite assertions that he makes is that use of fire is a human universal. So it's somehow almost worked its way into our genes, perhaps. But yeah, you can check that out.